What you are about to hear represents the most dangerous escalation scenario in modern military history, and the Western defense establishment has been actively wargaming this exact situation for the past 18 months. In the span of 72 hours, a regional conflict could transform into a multi-theater war that threatens the entire global economic system, and there are no comfortable answers about how it ends. The scenario we are examining tonight is not speculation. It is based on classified war game results that reached Washington 6 weeks ago, combined with structural analysis of force deployments, supply chain vulnerabilities, and historical precedent. What makes this moment unprecedented is that for the first time since World War II, America faces the possibility of simultaneous conflicts in 3 theaters: the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and the Western Pacific. And the structural forces that would drive this escalation are already in motion. There are 3 questions that will drive everything that follows. First, what is the exact mechanism by which a Middle Eastern conflict spreads to the South China Sea? Second, what is the week-by-week timeline of how this escalation unfolds once triggered? And third, what does game theory and historical analysis tell us about whether this scenario can be prevented or whether structural forces make it inevitable? I am going to take you inside every dimension of this crisis scenario. By the end of this analysis, you will understand why defense planners in Beijing, Washington, and Moscow are all preparing for the same sequence of events, and why the next 6 months represent the most dangerous period in the post-Cold War era. Let me be clear from the beginning. I am not advocating for this outcome. I am analyzing the structural forces and strategic incentives that make it increasingly probable. The truth, however uncomfortable, is that the is the only thing worth examining. But, the trigger mechanism, how Middle East escalation forces China's hand. The connection between the Middle East and the South China Sea is not obvious to most observers, but it becomes crystal clear when you understand the structural dependencies that bind these theaters together. Let me explain exactly how this works. China imports 67% of its oil, and 73% of that imported oil transits the Strait of Hormuz. This is not a minor dependency. This is China's economic jugular vein. Every single day, approximately 6.4 million barrels of crude oil flow from the Persian Gulf to Chinese refineries. That oil powers the manufacturing base that produces 30% of global goods. Now, here is what you need to understand about timing. China maintains a strategic petroleum reserve of approximately 90 days at current consumption rates. This reserve was built precisely for the scenario we are examining, a disruption of Persian Gulf supply lines. But 90 days is not infinite. It is a countdown clock. If conflict in the Middle East closes the Strait of Hormuz, China has exactly 3 months before its economy begins experiencing cascading failures. Fuel rationing begins, manufacturing shuts down, food distribution networks collapse, and the Chinese Communist Party faces the one scenario it fears above all others: domestic unrest triggered by economic crisis. Beijing has studied American military history extensively. Chinese strategists know that every major American war in the past 30 years has followed the same pattern: initial strikes, escalation, extended commitment, and mission creep that transforms limited operations into years-long occupations. If America attacks Iran, Chinese military planners assume the strait remains closed not for weeks, but for months or years. This is where game theory becomes essential. Put yourself in Beijing's position. You are watching America potentially launch a war that will strangle your economy within 90 days. You have 3 options. Option 1, do nothing and hope America wins quickly and reopens the strait. This option requires trusting American military efficiency and restraint. Given Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, how confident would you be? Option 2, attempt diplomatic intervention to reopen the strait. But you have no leverage over Iran or America in this scenario. Diplomacy requires power, and you have none in the Middle East. Option 3, create a crisis that forces America to divide its military resources, preventing the extended Middle East commitment that would keep the strait closed indefinitely. You open a second front that America cannot ignore. The third option is not what China wants. It is what structural forces compel China to do when facing economic strangulation. This is the trap that American strategists have failed to adequately consider. By creating conditions for extended conflict in the Middle East, America creates the strategic incentive for China to escalate in the Pacific. The trigger mechanism works like this. America commits to major military operations against Iran. The Strait of Hormuz closes. China's 90-day clock begins. At the 60-day mark, with no resolution in sight, Beijing makes the calculation that waiting means economic collapse and potential regime change. So, China acts. The question is not whether this sequence is possible. Pentagon War Games have confirmed it is the most probable Chinese response to extended Middle East conflict. The question is whether American decision makers understand they are creating the conditions for the very two-front war they claim to want to avoid. Week 1, the coordinated move. Let me walk you through exactly how the first week unfolds once China decides to act. The precision of this timeline comes from analyzing Chinese military exercises conducted over the past 3 years, which have rehearsed this exact scenario repeatedly. Day 1 begins at approximately 4 a.m. local time in the South China Sea. Chinese Coast Guard vessels, supported by maritime militia, establish a complete exclusion zone around Scarborough Shoal, located 120 nautical miles from the Philippine coast. Simultaneously, Chinese forces land on 2nd Thomas Shoal, where the Philippines maintains a small garrison on a grounded ship. The moves are not presented as acts of war. Beijing announces routine sovereignty enforcement operations in traditionally Chinese waters. The language is carefully calibrated. This is not invasion. This is not annexation. This is simply China finally enforcing what it has always claimed. The Philippine government immediately requests American assistance under the Mutual Defense Treaty signed in 1951. This is the moment American decision makers have dreaded. Honor the treaty and open a second major theater while already committed in the Middle East, or abandon the alliance and watch the entire American position in Asia collapse as every ally realizes American security guarantees are worthless. By day 3, the situation escalates. Chinese naval forces establish a blockade preventing Philippine resupply vessels from reaching garrisons in the Spratly Islands. No shots are fired. Chinese commanders have strict orders. No kinetic action unless fired upon first. Beijing wants America to either back down or fire the first shot that can be portrayed as American aggression. The American response reveals everything about the sustainability of empire. The Pentagon makes a devastating discovery. With substantial naval and air assets committed to the Middle East theater, the 7th Fleet cannot establish decisive superiority in the South China Sea without weeks of reinforcement. The carriers are in the wrong ocean. Day 5 brings the critical decision point. The president faces impossible options. Send available forces to challenge the Chinese blockade, risking military confrontation while under strength. Redirect forces from the Middle East, allowing Iran to consolidate gains and potentially extend strait closure indefinitely. Or request that the Philippines accept Chinese occupation while America builds up forces for potential later action. There is a fourth option that starts being discussed in emergency cabinet meetings. Negotiate a face-saving arrangement where China maintains its new positions in exchange for keeping shipping lanes open and providing security guarantees for oil transit. This option represents American acknowledgement that it cannot maintain military dominance in 2 theaters simultaneously. By day 7, the first week concludes with a stalemate that changes everything. China controls Scarborough Shoal and Second Thomas Shoal. American forces have not directly challenged the occupation. The Philippines feels abandoned. And every American ally in Asia is frantically reassessing whether American security commitments have any meaning. The week ends with oil prices reaching $190 per barrel as markets price in the possibility of extended Middle East conflict plus potential South China Sea closure to commercial shipping. The global economy enters what economists will later term the dual strait crisis. Week 2 through week 4, the cascade. Let me explain what happens in the following 3 weeks as the initial crisis spawns cascading consequences across multiple domains. This is where systemic interdependencies transform contained crisis into potential civilizational transformation. Week 2 begins with Japan's critical decision. Tokyo has watched China seize Philippine territory while America remained effectively paralyzed. Japanese strategists reach a conclusion that changes the security architecture of Asia. American conventional deterrence has failed. Japan announces emergency legislation to triple defense spending over 5 years and initiates quiet diplomatic conversations with both Beijing and Washington. The message to Beijing, Japan will not interfere with Chinese actions in the South China Sea if China provides ironclad guarantees regarding the Senkaku Islands and Taiwan. The message to Washington, America needs to choose between Middle East commitments and Pacific alliances because it cannot sustain both. This is the underdog resilience narrative manifesting in real time. China, facing economic strangulation, has turned apparent weakness into strategic leverage. Rather than waiting to be strangled, Beijing has created conditions where America must choose which commitment to abandon. Week 3 brings the financial cascade. The combination of Middle East war, South China Sea crisis, and Japanese hedging triggers what market historians will call the Pacific realignment. The Shanghai Stock Exchange, after suspending trading for 3 days, reopens with new currency swap arrangements that begin displacing dollar settlements for regional trade. Here is the specific mechanism. Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN nations, recognizing that American security guarantees are no longer reliable, begin negotiating direct arrangements with China. These arrangements involve settling trade in yuan rather than dollars, accepting Chinese security assurances rather than American, and acknowledging Chinese sphere of influence in exchange for economic stability. The petrodollar system, already stressed by Middle East conflict, faces existential pressure from the Pacific reorientation. Countries holding dollar reserves start gradually diversifying. The movement is not panic selling, but structural repositioning based on new geopolitical reality. Week 4 delivers the military implications. With American forces divided between Middle East operations and Pacific posturing, China completes what military analysts call the cabbage strategy in the South China Sea. Additional reefs and shoals receive Chinese facilities. The pace is methodical, not aggressive. Each move is small enough to avoid direct American military response, but collectively, they transform the strategic landscape. American submarines maintain presence during trains, but surface forces remain inadequate to challenge Chinese positions without risking escalation to full-scale war. The Pentagon conducts internal assessment that reaches brutal conclusion. Retaking Chinese positions would require amphibious operations approaching the scale of Normandy, with casualty projections that make such operations politically impossible. By the end of week 4, the crisis has stabilized at a new equilibrium that represents Chinese strategic victory. The South China Sea is functionally under Chinese control. American alliances in Asia are in crisis. And the global economic system is reorganizing around the new reality of Chinese regional dominance. Week 5, through week 8, the new normal. The second month represents what historians will recognize as the consolidation phase, where temporary crisis measures become permanent structural changes. Let me walk you through how this normalization process unfolds. Week 5 begins with negotiations. The United States, still engaged in Middle East operations, opens back-channel talks with Beijing. The American position has weakened substantially. Washington needs Chinese cooperation to ensure oil continues flowing to global markets despite Middle East disruption. China needs recognition of its South China Sea position as legitimate territorial control. The quiet understanding that emerges involves 3 components. First, China commits to keeping shipping lanes open in the South China Sea and using its influence with Iran to maintain some Persian Gulf oil flow. Second, America acknowledges that it will not militarily challenge Chinese positions in the Spratly Islands. Third, both sides agree to frame the arrangement as temporary crisis management rather than permanent settlement. This is the trap closing completely. What is portrayed as temporary accommodation becomes irreversible. Chinese facilities on disputed features become permanent. Other claimant nations, seeing American acceptance, begin their own negotiations with Beijing. The entire structure of international law regarding maritime claims reorganizes around Chinese power rather than legal principle. Week 6 through week 8 witness the domestic American reckoning. As news emerges that the administration has effectively conceded Chinese control over the South China Sea while remaining bogged down in Middle East operations, political consensus fractures. Hawks demand simultaneous escalation in both theaters. Isolationists demand complete withdrawal from both regions. The center struggles to articulate coherent strategy. The economic data arriving during this period makes the situation undeniable. American debt servicing costs have increased by 40% as global demand for Treasury bonds weakens. Oil at $180 per barrel has triggered recession. Inflation reaches levels not seen since the 1970s. The Fed faces impossible choice between raising rates to control inflation, which deepens recession, or maintaining low rates, which accelerates currency devaluation. This is the economic cascade in full effect. Initial oil shock plus financial system stress plus currency weakness equals stagflation that no monetary policy can solve. The crisis is structural, not cyclical. By week 8, the new normal has crystallized. America remains militarily engaged in the Middle East with no clear victory path. China controls the South China Sea and has substantially strengthened its position toward eventual Taiwan reunification. American allies have begun hedging through direct arrangements with Beijing. And the global economy has entered what will become known as the transitional recession, marking shift from American unipolar dominance to multipolar competition. The historical pattern, why this has happened before. Now that you understand the week-by-week mechanics of how escalation unfolds, you need to understand why this pattern is not new. History shows us that empires facing overextension in one theater become vulnerable to coordinated challenges in others. This is not unprecedented. This is how empires fall. Rome in the 3rd century faced simultaneous Persian pressure in the east and Germanic invasions in the north. The empire could not sustain two-front defense and entered the crisis of the 3rd century that nearly destroyed it. Rome survived that crisis, but never fully recovered its previous dominance. The Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century provides even more precise analogy. Overextended in the Balkans and Caucasus during World War I, the Ottomans faced coordinated challenges from multiple directions. Arab revolt in the south, Allied invasion at Gallipoli, Russian pressure in the north. Each individual challenge was manageable. The combined weight was fatal. The British Empire faced its own two-front crisis in the 1940s. German threat in Europe plus Japanese expansion in Asia forced Britain to choose. Churchill chose Europe. I do. The cost was permanent loss of Asian empire and superpower status. Every one of these historical examples demonstrates the same structural pattern. Extended commitment in one theater creates vulnerability that adversaries exploit by opening additional fronts. The overextended power must choose, divide forces, and risk defeat everywhere. I quit to your Europe everywhere. or concentrate forces and accept permanent loss of the abandoned region. America in 2026 faces this exact pattern. The belief that American military dominance is so overwhelming that simultaneous challenges can be defeated ignores the mathematical reality of force distribution. You cannot be everywhere at once. Resources committed to one theater cannot simultaneously defend another. Chinese strategists have studied these historical patterns extensively. The concept of winning without fighting from Sun Tzu applies directly. Create conditions where the adversary must choose between unacceptable options. Make the cost of resistance exceed the cost of accommodation. Victory comes not from battlefield dominance, but from strategic positioning that makes battlefield confrontation unnecessary. This is why the South China Sea scenario is not about Chinese military superiority over American forces. It is about creating conditions where American military superiority becomes irrelevant because the costs of applying that superiority exceed any possible benefit. SARS, the predictions, 3 scenarios. Now, I am going to tell you exactly what I think happens based on structural analysis and game theory. Remember, this is not prophecy. This is analytical assessment based on incentive structures and historical patterns. Scenario 1 has 45% probability, the negotiated realignment. In this scenario, America and China reach explicit understanding within 12 weeks of initial South China Sea escalation. America accepts Chinese sphere of influence in maritime Southeast Asia in exchange for Chinese cooperation, maintaining global oil flows and preventing further expansion. This represents managed decline, where America preserves core interests while accepting reduced regional dominance. The indicators for this scenario include 手腕二手的手腕, continued back-channel negotiations, lack of significant American force buildup in Pacific, and emerging joint statements about crisis management and stability. Watch for quiet removal of American military advisors from disputed areas and Philippine acceptance of Chinese territorial control in exchange for economic benefits. Scenario 2 has 35% probability, the prolonged stalemate. In this scenario, America refuses to formally acknowledge Chinese gains but lacks capacity to reverse them. Chinese positions in South China Sea remain contested but not challenged militarily. The situation freezes into new status quo that neither side explicitly accepts but both tacitly maintain. This scenario involves highest long-term costs because it maintains military tension without resolution, requiring sustained defense spending that accelerates American fiscal crisis. It delays inevitable reckoning while making eventual adjustment more painful. Scenario 3 has 20% probability, the escalation spiral. In this scenario, domestic political pressure forces American administration to attempt military reversal of Chinese positions despite operational challenges. Initial engagement leads to escalation dynamic where neither side can back down without catastrophic political consequences. This path leads to direct Sino-American conflict. I assess this scenario as lowest probability because both sides understand the catastrophic costs. However, 20% is not zero. The risk exists because crisis decision-making under time pressure with imperfect information can lead to miscalculation that no one wanted but everyone feels compelled to pursue. The critical period for determining which scenario manifests is week 6 through week 10 after initial Chinese moves. During this period, domestic political pressures in both countries crystallize, force positioning becomes clear, and the range of possible outcomes narrows dramatically. Watch for these specific indicators: American carrier positioning, Chinese military exercise patterns near Taiwan, Japanese diplomatic initiatives, and oil price movements. These will tell you which scenario is emerging before official statements acknowledge reality. Barsin tribe. Barsin. What this means for you. Let me bring this analysis back to concrete implications for ordinary people watching these developments unfold. The week-by-week timeline I have outlined represents more than geopolitical chess. It represents fundamental transformation of the system that has organized global commerce, security, and prosperity for 75 years. If scenario 1 manifests, expect prolonged period of economic adjustment as supply chains reorganize around new geopolitical reality. Countries and companies will need to choose whether they operate primarily within American or Chinese economic spheres. This choice will affect everything from technology standards to financial systems. If scenario 2 manifests, expect sustained inflation and economic uncertainty as the competition between systems prevents either from establishing stable rules. This is the worst scenario for ordinary economic activity because businesses cannot plan and invest when fundamental rules remain contested. If scenario 3 manifests, expect economic crisis exceeding 2008 financial crash, potential nuclear escalation risk, and transformation of daily life as societies mobilize for extended conflict. The most important thing to understand is that individual preparation matters. Diversify economic exposure across currencies and geographic regions. Reduce dependence on complex supply chains where possible. Build resilient local networks that can function during system disruption. This is not alarmism. This is recognition that we are watching the potential end of an era and the beginning of a new one. Every major historical transition creates danger and opportunity. Those who understand the structural forces shaping the transition can navigate it successfully. Those who assume the old system will persist unchanged will face severe adjustment costs. The synthesis, what we have learned. Let me bring together everything we have examined tonight into coherent understanding. The scenario of South China Sea escalation triggered by Middle East conflict is not random possibility. It is the logical consequence of structural forces that American foreign policy has created. American strategy assumes that military dominance provides freedom of action across multiple regions simultaneously. But dominance requires not just capability, but capacity, and capacity is finite. Every commitment reduces available resources for other challenges. China has recognized this constraint and built its entire strategic approach around exploiting it. The South China Sea moves are planned for the exact moment when American capacity is maximally constrained. This is not opportunism. This is methodological application of strategic theory. The week-by-week timeline demonstrates how initial crisis can rapidly cascade through interconnected systems, transforming regional challenge into global transformation. Economic interdependencies, alliance structures, and financial systems all amplify rather than dampen the initial shock. The historical pattern shows this is not unprecedented, but rather the recurring dynamic of imperial overextension creating vulnerability to coordinated challenge. Every major empire has faced this pattern. None has successfully managed simultaneous challenges without permanent strategic loss. The three scenarios represent the range of possible outcomes, with negotiated American retreat being most probable, prolonged stalemate being most costly, and direct escalation being least likely but most catastrophic. I want to acknowledge something important here. I might be wrong. The specific timeline might unfold differently than outlined. Chinese leadership might prioritize different considerations than my analysis suggests. American capacity might prove greater than structural analysis indicates. But here is what I am confident about. The underlying dynamic is real. America cannot maintain indefinite military dominance everywhere simultaneously. Adversaries recognize this and will coordinate challenges to exploit it. The era of uncontested American hegemony is ending, whether through managed transition or crisis-driven collapse. This analysis is not about rooting for American failure. This is about recognizing structural reality. I would prefer a world where peaceful transitions occur through negotiation and mutual accommodation. But hope is not analysis, and wishful thinking is not strategy. The most important question is not whether this specific timeline manifests exactly as outlined. The important question is whether American leadership recognizes the fundamental constraints they face and adjusts strategy accordingly, or whether they persist with commitments that exceed capacity until crisis forces adjustment at maximum cost. We will continue watching these developments closely. As the situation evolves, we will analyze each new development through this same framework of structural forces, game theory, and historical pattern recognition. The next 6 months will determine whether this scenario remains theoretical or becomes historical reality. I want you to think carefully about this framework. Question it. Test it against what you are seeing in the news. The most important thing is never to accept any analysis, including mine, without examining the evidence and logic yourself. Share your analysis in the comments. What scenario do you assess as most probable? What indicators are you watching? How does this analysis compare to what you are hearing from mainstream sources? History does not forgive those who ignore its lessons. We are watching a potential turning point, and understanding the forces at work is the first step toward navigating what comes next. Stay informed, stay critical, and stay prepared.